Okay. Hi. So I'm going to talk about breaking down the barriers of research compliance at UNM. So you're hearing a lot about responsible conduct of research, and when it comes to being responsible and ethical about your research, you also have to be compliant with your research. And sometimes that can be hard and frustrating, and a lot of people see compliance as a barrier. It may be on your side, it may be on the institution's side, but nevertheless, it's always considered a barrier. Let's try to break down that barrier. So when you're thinking of your project, you want to know how compliance impacts your research. Are you working, and we're actually going to talk about things to consider. So the university is committed to the highest standards of ethics, integrity, responsibility, and compliance. They have several policies and procedures. We also, there are federal regulations and laws depending on the type of research that you're doing. So that's a lot, and of course, not all research is the same. So does that mean you have to comply with every single thing? If you're not an animal subject researcher, do you have to comply with animal subjects research laws and policies? No. There are things that you do have to consider. So UNM is really interesting in that we have two campuses. We have the Health Sciences Center, and we have a main campus. So when you're thinking about compliance in your research and your activities, you want to know what your affiliation is with the institution and also the location of your research. So, are you a UNM investigator? Are you working with a UNM PI? Is your research biomedical? Does this mean, okay, so my PI is an MD, so I must be affiliated with HSC? Are you going to be working with the national labs? There are certain compliance things that impact that impact your research and your work. And also, where are you going to be conducting your research? So Adelicia will touch on export control laws, which will impact your compliance. Another thing to consider is the nature of your research activities. So Bill talked about animal subjects research, but we're going to talk about, I'll touch on a little bit more. So we heard about funding, NIH, NSF. We want to know who is funding your project because they have certain policies and procedures on how to comply with their regs. We also want to think about whether or not your research is fundamental or classified, and Adelicia will talk about that with respect to export control. Or are you working with a lab that is using highly sensitive materials that could be military or could have potential military applications? Or is your research truly fundamental? What are you studying? Are you working with people? Are you working with animals? Are you working with tissues? Are you working with blood? Are you just working with survey data, maps? These are the kinds of things that you want to think about because depending on what you're doing, you're going to have to comply with certain things. And also the feasibility. Do you actually have the funding or resources to carry out this project, this great idea of yours? Are you meeting any of the minimum requirements, whether they're institutional, federal, state? And do you have a sufficient time? And this is where research compliance, or compliance in general, can become a potential barrier, is when you run into time issues. So UNM does support research compliance. We do have several offices that oversee and kind of administer the compliance efforts here at UNM. And they're staffed with knowledgeable people within those areas. And they're there to help facilitate the process of compliance, but also help the investigators who actually need to comply with these certain things. So that's a lot, but it's actually pretty simple. When it comes to compliance, you want to know what your boundaries are. What are your actual limitations? And this really depends on what kind of research you're doing. So plan ahead. This will definitely help you break down those barriers of the different types of compliance that you're going to run into. And also get help when needed. There are offices put in place. There are people that are there to help you. A lot of times we have students come into our compliance offices and they actually sit down with the staff themselves. And I've heard some positive things, like especially with IRB. Sometimes that could be a really long process, But if you actually go in and have someone read through your protocol, go through each section, talk about your research, how they can kind of not bend the rules to fit your project, but how you can navigate those different policies. That way you can actually conduct your research ethically and compliant. So I'll dive into human subjects research. How many of you guys are actually human subjects researchers? Okay, a lot. So, all right, so this will probably mean nothing to you. But for everybody else that isn't familiar with human subjects research, we'll touch on a bunch of things. So when you're working with human subjects research, what we're looking at is what kind of information you're obtaining. And that information should be from a living individual. So when the board or the people that actually look at human subjects research, they're actually looking at the information of whether or not that information is private and identifiable. In your interactions with that person or the data about that individual, you're actually getting it through an interaction or an intervention or a previously collected data set. So when you put all of that together, that defines pretty much a human subject or human. Now, there's another issue. So if you're conducting a systematic investigation designed to contribute or develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge, you're doing research. So we always get the question, does my project mean that I have to go through the IRB or whatever? That's what they're looking for, is they're looking for that definition from the beginning. So I kind of mentioned the IRB. So this is a board of people that are designated to review the ethics of your project or your activity. So there's a whole list of things that the board has to meet, very similar to IACUC's regs. I won't get into that, it's kind of boring. But they're looking at the ethics of your project or your activity. And really, they're wanting to get down to the protection of the rights and welfare of the human subject. With animals, they need that advocate. Humans, the same thing. But humans can consent themselves to be willing to volunteer for your project. And the board is wanting to make sure that there's that process in place if it's applicable, or if you're waiving that because you're just looking at data that's already been collected and you have permission from the source to use that information. So once they look at your project, there's a process there where they review, and they actually give authority to approve a project, or they can ask for changes, or they can totally disapprove a project. And this is on behalf of the institution. This is actually common across the United States. If you go to another research university, they will have IRBs if they are conducting human subjects research. Internationally, they're called ethics review boards. And a lot of countries are actually implementing their own ethics review process for human subjects research. So when will it apply to your activities? And this is where we get the whole question of, does my project fit the criteria of IRB or whatever? So really, if you're thinking of doing interviews, surveys, focus groups, observations, analysis of data that's been collected on a certain set of people or a group of people, you might want to consider talking to your local board. If you're going to be doing this project for graduation, for a publication, for a grant, or for a class, you want to talk to the board or the office before you actually move forward. Can't you just do it? Wouldn't it be great to just like cut somebody open for research without their permission? No. So all activities that involve human subjects or in research at UNM are subject to IRB review and approval prior to implementing or starting that activity. And this goes back to the compliance issue, the commitment that UNM has made. So how does that impact you if you're wanting to do any of those? If you want to publish, if you have a funding opportunity, if you want to graduate, you have a contract that tells you you have to do this activity, or you have to administer this survey, and it meets the qualifications of human subjects research, you're going to have to go through the board to get that approval before you engage in that activity. So we have programs, like I said. UNM is separate, so we actually have 2 support offices. And this, again, so we have on main campus, we have the Office of the IRB that supports UNM main and branch campus investigators. Their scope is mainly social behavioral, but they do look at some biomedical research. On North Campus, we have the Human Research Protections Office, and they support the health sciences researchers. And these are mostly biomedical research. So this goes back to know your affiliation, know where your project is being done, because who you interact with will definitely play into your timeline. If you end up submitting your project to the wrong office, you might get a delay for a reason. You're like thinking, well, this has been in the queue for a while. How come I haven't heard back? Make sure you know which office you actually need to work with, and definitely call. We'll get to that side. So the support office, they actually provide guidance to the researchers. They oversee the compliance activities. So I'm not sure if you've heard of amendments, continuing reviews, and closures. Those are important submissions to keep on your radar. The office does audits and monitoring on behalf of the board. And they also look into protocol events, complaints, and non-compliance. Do you guys know what those are? Yeah, no? Do you want to know more about those? So if something wrong goes with your research, or something bad happens, someone dies because you injected them with a research drug, and what happens? That's called an adverse event. So you have to report that to your sponsor. You also have to report it to your institutional review board. You have to tell them what happened and why, and what are your plans to stop this from ever happening again. So the office that facilitates that whole process would be the support office here locally. So there are specific requirements in training. So principal investigator eligibility has been a hot topic over the past couple of years. Right now, for both campuses, in order to be a principal investigator on a human subjects research protocol, you have to be a faculty. Or you have to be a staff that's at a certain grade with a letter of academic title. I know that a lot of students here actually are their own PIs, but for the purposes of being the PI of record, it has to be what I said before. The second requirement is that you have to have 0 compliance issues, or if you do have compliance issues, you have to have them resolved. So this will impact your PI, responsible faculty. If they're non-compliant because some student before you didn't submit their closure paperwork, that could impact you from even submitting a project for IRB review. Let's see. And then there's a document called a protocol. This is like your project plan. This pretty much describes the present, the past, and the future. What are you doing now? What kind of literature review have you done? How are you going to get or maintain your data once you've done your research? What's going to happen? There are training requirements that you have to have. So all investigators that are listed on a human subjects protocol has to complete the city human subjects research training. So city has, how many of you have taken city? Okay, so there's a responsible conduct of research option. So that does not satisfy the actual 4-hour-long course that you have to complete for human subjects research training. You can take the RCR component, that's fine, but you actually have to take the human subjects research training course. It is longer, but that's the only one that they're accepting. If you came from another institution, or if your investigators have come from another institution, they have their own training that's not city, you can definitely work with the office and they can see if it's comparable to city. So the submissions could be a very grueling process, but the office actually has a submission checklist to help you identify which documents are absolutely required for a certain type of submission. And then they have an online protocol submission system for actually both campuses do. And they have instructions on how to navigate those processes. So with main campus, you're going to be working with IRB-Net. With North Campus, you're going to be working with Click IRB. 2 totally different systems. We can chat more about those. see. So the IRB website for main campus is irb.unm.edu. If you're going to be working with someone from health sciences, it's a whole different URL. I don't even know what it is because they've changed it. But there's all the contact information. If you have specific questions about your project, I'd recommend going in and actually go onto their listserv, subscribe to the listserv. They actually send out communications through the listserv, important announcements, updates, tips. That's a good thing to do. Register for a workshop. They actually have workshops on how to navigate the process, how to develop a protocol, how to develop a consent form, how to navigate the regs, and how to navigate the submission system. And then use a checklist to make sure that you have all the correct materials. And then save a copy of a cheat sheet. So I actually created a cheat sheet for the office for IRB.net that you can follow like line by line, and it's just a one-pager, and it gets you through different processes within the IRB.net system. But what I was going to mention is contact the office if you have any questions about your specific project. Each project is so unique, and there are certain regs regs within the regs that might apply to your project that may not apply to someone else's project. I mentioned like informed consent, or actually getting someone's consent to be in your project versus waiving that consent process if you're just looking at data. So there are regs within those that you can play around with. Do you guys have any questions about human subjects research? Yes. So it's good because if the journal that you're submitting to, if they want to see a copy of your approval letter, the only person that's going to be listed on that approval letter is your PI of record. So it would be good to put that in your publication. But you could also always say that this project was done under the direction of PI of record from UNM. But it's actually your project. Does that make sense?
Were you asking that should your PI be a co-author with you?
Correct.
Ah.
That'd be a good idea.
Well, not if she did all the work.
Well, no, but
yeah,
I mean.
No, yeah. That's a hard one. I wonder how you do that.
I guess it depends on your PI. Get their input first. Yeah, and the journal too. But for more specific questions, since we have limited time, we'll get one more question, and then we're going to move on to the next one. Sorry, I just totally spaced. One more question.
If I have to interview people from different countries, do I need to have an RBI in those countries, or is this only
No, it's the
UNM?
same thing. Yeah. So you have to. So if you are doing research from UNM or representing UNM in any way, even though your research is going to be done internationally, you yourself have to get approval from here in order to do the research outside of the U.S. Now, if you have no connection to UNM, but you're doing research, I'd recommend looking at your laws or regulations that govern that country or that area, because those will actually determine whether or not there's a board, a local review board, or an entity to review your project on behalf of you. So yeah, that's very complicated stuff. But if you have any other questions, we'll hold it. Sorry, I'm still going to work on stuff. Yeah. So I was going to go over animal subjects research, but Bill kind of went over that already. One thing I do want to point out with animal subjects research is that there is an animal resource facility that provides the best possible care for animals here at the university. There's one on the North Campus, and I think biology and psychology have their own housing. So in order to access the one on North Campus, and I'm not sure if it's the same for biology and psychology, but you do have to have medical clearance in order to access those facilities. So if you think, oh, I'm just going to do animal research, or I'm going to teach with animals and I have to get an animal from a certain facility, you actually have to have clearance in order to get through the door. Let me see. Sorry. And then, so I'm going to talk about biosafety. How many of you guys work with biological specimens or bio things? Okay. So do you guys know what biosafety is? Okay, you do? All right, for everybody else, let's see what biosafety is. So there are these cool signs, and it kind of like reminds me of the zombie apocalypse movies. But you'll see these biohazard signs pasted on doors or lab spaces that actually have biological materials. And there are certain things about this sign that are actually very important. So biosafety is the application of safety precautions that reduce a laboratorian's risk of exposure to a potentially infectious microbe and limit the contamination of that work environment and ultimately the community. So you'll see these, you might see these signs posted in places. So really with respect to biosafety, you don't want to, if you see a sign there and you're actually working in the lab space, you don't want to eat anything, you don't want to touch your eyes, you just want to be very safe because you don't want to infect yourself. But also you don't want to carry that outside. So depending on the type of lab you're working in, you might have to change your clothes. But the number that you said, did you see biosafety level 1, 2, 3, 4? So there are different levels of biosafety, and then this really depends on the risk of that microbe or biological material that's within that lab. So you can't really see that, sorry. But so the higher the number, the higher risk of infectious or infectability. I think here at UNM we do have up to BSL 3, which I don't remember which one it is. Can you help me out here?
Restricted space live microbes.
Live microbes? Okay, so like
something that could potentially infect you, but unlikely.
Okay, so like Staph aureus?
No.
No?
No, it has to be like a modified version.
Okay. All right. We don't have Ebola here, right? No,
Yes,
that's
we
we do.
Well, we don't have live Ebola, but we like TB,
Uh-huh.
HIV, hantavirus, those are all BSL-3
Okay.
agents.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So we have a group of people called the Institutional Biosafety Committee that reviews and approves covered biological research. We also have an institutional biosafety officer that inspects labs, reports problems, violations, research-related illnesses, and develops emergency plans and advises lab security. When will this apply to your activities? Well, if your research involves the use of biological materials, you're going to have to work with the IBC, or you're working in an approved lab designated as 1 through 3, or BSL 1 through 3. Can't you just do the research? Again, no. Whoa, what happened? No. So all UNM affiliated personnel must have an approved IBC protocol to conduct the research, and anyone working within those facilities has to be listed on an approved IBC protocol. So how does this impact me? Publications, funding opportunities, graduation, health, safety, environment, risk, community. So at UNM, we have the Biohazard Compliance Office, which supports both campuses. And they're actually located on North Campus. They do a bio-inventory, they inspect your labs, they provide advice on containment equipment. They have a research risk assessment. You can actually do your own initial assessment of your protocol. They also have an agent program management, so depending on the type of agent you're working with, you'll have different management plans. And they also investigate incidents or accidents. And these are the people that you'll actually report to if something bad happens. So there are specific requirements. So you do have to be eligible to be a PI on an IBC protocol. You have to get certain permits, depending on if you're working with the CDC or USDA, depending on what kind of things you're working with. You have to have an IBC protocol, and all of your personnel have to be trained, they have to be qualified, and they have to be cleared. And then definitely conduct that initial assessment, initial risk assessment of your research. So there are different biosafety trainings that you have to complete, and again, depending on the type of lab you're working in, and then what you're working with, and then the materials you're actually using. So that's their website. Tim Muller is the biosafety officer. He's great. Monica is the specialist. She's the one that goes around and pastes or changes out your biosafety sheets. So tips to be successful: conduct an initial risk assessment, use safe practices, and then report any problems, exposures or accidents or illnesses to the biosafety officer as soon as possible. Definitely require medical surveillance through EOHS, and then correct your errors promptly so that way they don't happen again. And everyone can be safe.
So how many of you guys have submitted your financial conflict of interest for this academic year already? You have just a couple people. Okay. So what is the financial conflict of interest policy, and why do we have to submit financial conflicts of interest disclosures? So the policy that governs FCOI is policy E110 in the faculty handbook, and this defines a financial conflict of interest as any situation associated with an investigator's participation in research where their outside financial interest may come into conflict with their work on the proposed research project, okay? Or an investigator's situation could directly and significantly compromise his or her primary allegiance to the institution. So that's what the definition is. And we'll talk more about how we manage this. So a lot of people view conflicts of interest as a bad thing. Like, oh, I have a conflict. It's obviously a negative thing to occur. When actually, these are the situations that we kind of want to occur in the modern research arena. This shows that our investigators are taking their technology that they developed in their academic setting, going into the community, having a spin-off company, commercializing their technology. They're sitting on boards. They're involved in the community. They're creating economic development. They're hiring students to work in their outside entity as well as supervising them in their university activity. Okay, so these things make us look good. They show that we're doing our job as an academic research institution. And so the goal of the financial conflicts of interest policy is not to eliminate conflicts. What we want to do is identify them and manage them. And the key to do that is disclosure. So disclosure is required for anyone who's working on sponsored research, human subject research, animal subject research, and research that's funded through a formal award from UNM, so like a RAC award. That's like a Research Allocation Committee award. Okay, who must disclose? So any person who is responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting of UNM research. This includes the PI, co-PI, faculty, staff, students, non-UNM consultants, and cleared faculty and students. So if you're working on a really big grant and you have to hire someone to answer phones, then they're not going to have to submit. But if you have someone who is collecting and interpreting data, then they have to submit because they're involved in the design, conduct, or reporting of UNM research. Okay. What are disclosable interests related to research? So interests that are related to research have subject matter overlap with what you're doing, right? So if you have, $10,000 of Apple stock, that's disclosable via the threshold because $10,000 is the amount for non-public health funded projects. But you do research in like biomedical engineering, that wouldn't really have subject matter overlap. You know what I mean? So it has to have a clear overlap with the research that you're conducting. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, it's related to the previous slide. I submitted my, I don't remember the name of the survey, but I have submitted it. But I didn't know that if I hire transcribing company, they have to submit that survey?
How about I get with you after and we can talk about it in more detail so that I can answer your question. Okay? Alrighty. let's see. So what are examples of potential COIs? So an investigator's consulting relationship with the sponsor of his research. So sometimes some of our PIs also consult or work for the organization that's funding their UNM research. A management role or equity holdings in an entity that's supporting his or her research. Ownership in patents or technology, that's the subject matter of his research, or supervising the same students in both the university activity and at his or her company. So the primary purpose of the student is to get to their degree, right? But when we're hiring students in their outside entity, we want to make sure that the primary focus is on that advancement to graduation and not the focus on what they're doing in the investigator's outside company, right? What's not a COI? An investigator's consulting relationship with an organization that conducts research in an area that's not related to their research. Stocks or equity in a company that does not constitute a significant portion of the company's total holdings. So like the Apple example, if you have $10,000 of Apple and you do computer science, so there is subject matter overlap, but $10,000 of Apple is like a very small amount of the company's total holdings, so that wouldn't be disclosable. A lot of times I have people disclosing their whole stock portfolio to me, and I'm like, good for you, but I don't really need to know that, you know, as long as it's related to your research. And volunteer work that's not related to your research activities. So how do you disclose? So it's a really easy process. What you do is you go to the research compliance website, the FCOI site, and it says submit a disclosure. UNM investigators use the UNM link. Non-UNM investigators use the non-UNM link. You are going to click the link, fill out information, and it has question logic included. So depending on your answers, it might be a very short survey that'll take like 5 minutes, or it might be longer. You might have to stop and then go and get additional information and then come back to it. After these disclosures are submitted, I will conduct a review, give each person a heat index, and based off of your disclosure, different things will happen. The ultimate thing is you'll be put on a management plan with a monitor, and we will have stipulations that you have to follow throughout the academic year in order to ensure compliance with regard to your financial interests. Okay, anyone have any other questions? I will get back to her in after my next presentation. Yes?
So what level of personnel do you want on this? Do you want, so graduate students, we could do this, but we don't control the funding directly. Is this PI and above, or should you do graduate students, undergraduates?
I would say if you're going to be working on any type of research at UNM, submit your FCOI. So it doesn't matter what level you're at, if you're faculty, staff, student, if you're involved in the design, conduct, or reporting of UNM research activities, you have to submit. Okay? Anyone else? No? Okay, so I'm going to go, I think, and talk about export control. Okay, so as we all know, science and technology thrive off of the creation and open dissemination of knowledge. At the same time, it is our responsibility to protect sensitive, controlled, and obviously classified information from being authorized by people who should not have access, right? And so a lot of the times people have the idea that these two concepts come into conflict with each other, right? So creation, open dissemination, and then protection, right? But really they have a symbiotic relationship, because in order for an academic to be able to publish, right, it's publish or perish in academia, we have to have certain protocols in place to protect the information until it's ready for disclosure. And so I'm going to talk about U.S. export control laws and how they apply to academic research. So a lot of people think of export control as like creating an item and selling it on the world market, but there are different ways that export controls affect your research activity here and also abroad. So the overarching mission of my office is, we're committed to the highest level of compliance. Our goal is to say yes and show you how to conduct your research within the limits of the law. And we strive to balance the two competing demands of open dissemination and protection of sensitive, controlled, and classified research. So how many of you guys know that we are a clear defense contractor and we can accept contracts up to the top secret level? No, you didn't know that. So we do top secret research at UNM. We don't do it here on campus. We use the labs or, AFRL, Sandia, but we do have contracts all the way up to the top secret level, and so that's why we have me and Debbie Kudis. We're the facility security officer, and it's our job to protect that research from access, okay? And that has to do with like military applications, weapons, and things like that. So why must we be concerned? So if you violate U.S. export control laws, you can get fines up to $2 million, be put in prison 20 years for each violation. They're like super serious. UNM can also be subject to administrative penalties that could affect up to 400 contracts. And the institution can be debarred from receiving federal contracts over $25,000. So $25,000 like research project is a very small, tiny drop in the bucket research project. So if we can't receive contracts over that, it would significantly affect our ability to be a state-of-the-art research facility. Okay, so the intersections of research. So she talked previously about fundamental research and then classified and export-controlled research. So fundamental research, so it's open concepts, validated theories, peer review, quality checks. There's no controls on the specific research. It's going to be published. Classified and export-controlled research, it'll be classified, obviously. There's a need to know. It's mission-oriented. It's highly sensitive. There's a lot of quality controls, publication restrictions, and also certain foreign national restrictions based off of the type of research that's conducted. Okay, so we want you to be able to recognize certain risks, so export control red flags, and know who to contact to mitigate those risks. So U.S. export controls are a very complicated set of laws and regulations, and they vary depending on the activity, the country, and a lot of other variables, the type of research that you're conducting. So we want you to be able to understand, oh, this might be an export risk. Like, let's say you're working on a project and you're going to be working with an international collaborator. The fundamental research exclusion, which allows us to conduct research without being subject to export control laws, doesn't cover physical exports. So when you're collaborating internationally, you don't have that safeguard. If you're going to be taking equipment with you abroad, we want to be able to identify the equipment and the controls that apply based off of the location that you're going and the activity that you will be performing, and let you know if that activity is allowable. Okay, so what are red flags? So if you're working on a funded research project, it would be publication restrictions from the sponsor, because that erodes our ability to conduct the research under the fundamental research exclusion. Foreign national restrictions, same thing. International travel, international shipments, foreign collaborations, indications from the sponsor that it is controlled. It says this is export controlled. The research will have a military end use. The research will result in a dual-use technology. So what's a dual-use technology? It means it has both a military and civilian application. An example would be your car clicker. So you can go and open your car, but you can also set off a bomb, right? So to certain countries, your car clicker is a controlled item. Also, your Apple iPad is a controlled item. Under the classification, it's for anti-terrorism. So there are certain countries that you can't take your iPad to because it's controlled. And you probably wouldn't know that, but I would tell you, right? And those are like the legit, like bad countries. You know, if you're going to like, you know, I don't know, London, or you're going somewhere kind of friendly, you're going to be fine. But if you're, you know, there are categories of countries and what you can take. So, you know, that's just an example that you can use an iPad to set off a rocket or whatever they're doing there. Okay, so a university example. This is a really interesting case. So Professor Reese Roth, he actually just got released from prison. He did 4 years in federal prison and had to pay a lot of money for illegally exporting military technology that had to do with surveillance technology that would go on the wings of drones. And what he did was he had a small subcontract. And it was a larger prime award from the AFRL to an outside company, and then he had like $4,000 subcontract. Obviously export controlled, dealing with military technology. It said foreign national restriction, US person only. So he ended up hiring a Chinese national and an Iranian to work on the project. He also physically exported the technology, the technical data to China and presented at a conference. They found out that he did that. His export control officer, so me at Tennessee, told him, don't do it, don't do it. She had that on record, and he did it anyway. And he's kind of like the martyr for fundamental research and saying, oh, I was doing fundamental research, it doesn't apply. But first, it was a controlled contract, so it's not fundamental. Two, the fundamental research exclusion doesn't cover physical exports, and he physically exported. So he went to prison, and he's the poster child for what not to do with export control laws. And so I'm here to make sure that none of my researchers end up being the next poster child, because we don't want that to happen. And these things are really scary. The consequences are severe, and the regulations are so complicated that it's really hard for our investigators to be able to effectively manage their export control issues without seeking guidance from someone like me and my office. All right, I'm going to touch a little bit on industrial security, but I'm not going to go too much into it. So this has to do with classified contracts. Anyone, well, I know no one in here has a clearance from UNM. You're not a UNM cleared person, though. I would know you. Oh, okay, yeah, so if you need a clearance, so let's say you think that you're gonna be working on a classified contract, you would come to our office and we would help facilitate that process to get you a clearance. You have to have a letter that states your need to know the exact contract that you're gonna be working off of. And because we're a cleared defense contractor, we have responsibilities to work some counterintelligence at UNM. So if you have suspicious contacts or something like that, our office is who you contact. And then we work with the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and stuff like that to mitigate any threats to your research. Our office also teaches just phone security. We teach how to keep your personal information safe. So a wide variety of services that we conduct. Other training, cybersecurity, social networking security, laptop and cell phone security, international travel security. We also teach workplace violence. So if someone walked in that door with a gun and started shooting, we would teach you what to do to go home safe to your family.
Do that before the vaccine?
Huh?
Do that before the person.
Yeah, so if you want to learn how to do that, come to us and we'll teach you how to do that. Anyway, okay. I think that's it for my part. If you guys have any specific questions, I'll go to the back and you can come and talk to me. I think I have some business cards that I'll lay out, so if you want to, maybe you think, oh, maybe I might need to talk to her later on, you can come to my office and we can sit down, have a one-on-one conversation about the type of research that you conduct and how export controls might apply, and then what we can do to mitigate your risks to yourself and to the institution. Alrighty?